Our moderator is quite an impressive guy. He's the Chief Technology Officer at Opscode. He comes from Microsoft, where he was Director of Engineering and worked on the Azure platform. And before that, he was a founding member, architect, and lead developer for Amazon's EC2. So this is a guy who knows a lot more about the cloud than simply the weather. So I'd like to introduce Chris Brown, who will introduce our panel. Welcome, Chris.
Good morning. Excellent. Who peaked too early? I made it to the first night's event, and that was it. All right, I'd like to bring out my panel. Real quick here, you've heard who I am. Since we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to hand it, let's get comfortable. I'm going to have everybody introduce themselves once they get settled in here, and then we'll get down to it. I like this comfortable setting. The old panels used to be, table and microphones. This looks like they actually like each other. Let's find out what happens in a half hour. All right.
We do like each other.
There we go. All right. Well, in that case, you get to introduce yourself first.
Hi, I'm Kyle MacDonald, Vice President of the Cloud Business at Canonical. Ubuntu.
I'm Greg de Koenigsberg. I'm a VP of Community at Eucalyptus.
I'm Craig McCluckey, the Lead Product Manager at Google for Google Compute Engine.
Hi, I'm Duncan Johnston-Watt, CEO and founder of CloudSoft.
All right. So to get started, I think, just let me put it out there, this whole thing in the cloud with infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, I think we're doing it wrong. I think we're having the wrong argument. I certainly think we're having an argument, and that's great, but I think we're doing it wrong. So we talk about infrastructure as being about APIs, and the predominant argument is whose API is best and why. And then we talk about platform, where the big platform vendors will tell you that their platform does everything that you'll need. Right? So there's a false argument here between API and walled garden, and I think it's wrong. I think it's going to hurt us all. I think what we actually need to talk about is a way to define capabilities in the cloud, something declarative, and something that allows the consumers to tell us as implementers what it is they actually want. So I have to do it though. First up, so on infrastructure and APIs, who's got the best one and why? I love this because there's going to be a big pause.
The short answer
Who's
is...
got the best one and why? EC2, because that's the one that everyone is using.
So I would say, I think the EC2, there's a maturity gap. It's definitely the one that everybody's sort of known the longest. It's the one that everybody's sort of used. I think you're starting to see some projects like the OpenStack API efforts sort of crystallize, and they're gaining a little bit of maturity, but there's something to be said for being old. So I think
I agree.
That helps.
Wow. Was that about the API or about me? Because
I'm just saying that maturity helps. So
you were saying?
well, I was going to say, I don't think any of them are by any means the right answer, but I think it's, in terms of false goals, I think trying to come up with a single API is somewhat of a waste of time at the infrastructure as a service tier. I think we are where we are in the industry, and I actually think it's, there are now a number of projects like JCloud, Delta Cloud, and so forth that have said, the world as we find it, the world that we have to deal with is a world where there are, you're never going to get complete agreement. So let's make the best of that. So there is now, a lot of work in creating an abstraction that is useful and good enough for the job. So, I know a lot about JCloud. It's not complete by any means, but it's a rolling roadmap of contributions from people based on what's required. So I'm more pragmatic, I think, in terms of the infrastructure. I think PaaS is far more interesting.
So,
yeah,
Craig,
I would agree. I mean, I think that first it's worth recognizing that while we've achieved tremendous traction and momentum in the cloud space, it is a field that is largely in its nascency. We're still trying to figure out the shape and the direction that we'll ultimately head up in. I think that people are, by and large, over-focused on the API and look at API convergence as being the cure-all for for the cloud space. And I don't think that we've adequately thought through the semantic underpinnings of an API. Actually achieving a world in which you have true portability of workloads purely at the API level is almost intractable. The semantic differences for of a variety of platforms, and the complexities of sort of real-world applications make it a little bit of a fool's errand. And I do agree. I don't think the solution is about achieving, one API to rule them all. And I don't think it's, I don't think API is ultimately the solution when you think about it. I do think that we need to get to a world where we have a more expressive set of frameworks to describe resources, consume resources in a very open fashion.
Yep.
So I think it's also, so when you ask a question like the infrastructure API, we can all discuss which one's our favorite and how long we've been doing it. But the real question is how many tools are building around adopting it and making it so that nobody actually knows what the API is. So for example, we spent a bunch of time at Canonical building Juju, specifically so that we didn't actually have to, so people who are deploying workloads, who are putting things into clouds, can be deploying them to the cloud, without actually having to know anything about the API underpinnings of how it works, where it goes, or what it is. Instead, what they're saying is these are the services that I'd like to run, and this is the place I'd like to run them, and then expecting a framework, an application, an abstraction layer similar to JClouds to do that powerful work for them. So the real question of how popular an infrastructure API is when a bunch of abstraction layers will actually, when you have tools that actually leverage it.
So it's the ecosystem answer, that the API is good if a number of people then find a way to build on top of it.
So yeah, Juju is a good example. It's a great example. It's seductively simple. So now there's a point about that, which is we're not. We're working on equivalent projects. There are many projects in this area. Seductively simple is okay on one level, but on another level, I think to your point, Craig, we do need some clear guidance here on the underlying semantics, so that there is true portability. We were part of an announcement yesterday of a PaaS management standard, and had very extreme responses to that. A lot of vendor angst. It's too early for standards. It's too early for this to even be discussed. And then very strong end user. This is the best thing. This is what we need. We need guidance. We need people coming together and discussing these things. So in the meantime, Juju's come along. We've got something called Brooklyn, which is part of in that same ecosystem. We're all doing our own thing, and I think I know you like a panel to be very, have violent disagreement, but I think one thing we would probably all agree on is that, it probably is the right time to have that discussion. If we can do it at the PaaS level, we may not make the same mistakes that have happened at the infrastructure.
I think you really hit on the key point, is that the bimodal distribution there, the folks who are implementing, hey, it's way too early for standards, because I don't know what mine is yet. And then you have the consumers on the other end saying, I'd really like to have a standard because now I don't know how to build. And that's the thing. That's why I think in some sense there's a false argument, about the API, because what we're not doing is listening to the consumer who's saying, here's how I'd like to think about the thing you're handing me.
Yep.
So the last little thing I'd like to ask in that vein is, so Simon Wardley likes to talk about the fact that there's no room for innovation in the API. Just eat the one you've been given and start innovating elsewhere. So in summary, is that true or false?
False. That's a one-word answer. I think everyone is now, familiar with the idea of extensibility, that you can have a common set of core concepts that you all agree on and still innovate beyond that.
Absolutely. I think it has to be false. I think that being locked into a lowest common denominator framework and having the base expressiveness of how you describe a system, how you describe a composited system, being locked into a legacy term does not produce great results. And so beyond it being sort of from an implementation detail false, it is essential that is false. We cannot afford to be locked into a lowest common denominator framework at this point.
So if by example you were to look at, say, the EC2 API and say, here's one thing very clearly that was left out or is wrong and is an area for innovation, is there an obvious example?
An administrative API set.
Administrative in the sense of?
In the sense of, what do you do when you're the one who actually owns the cloud? Amazon doesn't expose APIs for, how to do administrative functions on the cloud itself, right? So Eucalyptus necessarily extends that API to provide some of those features, right? And and that's the nose under the tent, right? It's obvious that you can extend, and so then the question is, how will you continue to extend? But if you make the choice to extend, you have to do it in very careful ways
and somehow friendly fashion to the ecosystem.
Right.
So I think it's interesting. I quite like Simon, so sometimes this is hard. So the EC2 API, I think, is dominant because of people's usage, and therefore he's sort of
the
right
first mover
in that
effect
we
is
should.
huge. Yeah.
But there is also the minor difference there is that it was something that was created by one company, and it was created to support their cloud, which has massive adoption, right? So Juju originally was built for EC2, and that was the API that we sort of know and expose the best. But in the context of building your own clouds, and you're going to use other things as people who build clouds, either as other service providers or for yourself inside like your own walls. And in that case, you can't really run Amazon. Like you can run something that's approximate to it, but you're sort of always charting back to what they had. So I think there's the work that's being done with various standards bodies, things like OpenStack API and others. They're kind of interesting because they're going to be groups of people who are going to put together collectively some of the stuff that Amazon has left out or decided not to extend on.
Like what?
Well, I mean, the administrative APIs are huge. That'll be, that's part of every part of OpenStack.
Right.
A much deeper network functionality will come out.
That would be my first example. Networking.
The ability to do better descriptions and semantics of storage and that sort of thing. Those will all be part of it. And the more that you expose lots of those fine-grained pieces, the more things like Juju, the more things like Brooklyn can actually take advantage of it. Actually, the problem right now with Juju and Brooklyn is that when we go to spin up an instance, at least in Juju's case, at Amazon, we're limited to a certain amount of things that we can do in terms of bringing it up, putting stuff on it, and how we do those with like more complex systems, right? We're actually, and so we've spent a bunch of time working with cloud providers to sort of, in the case of Azure, in the case of Rackspace, do HP Cloud System, like to do more stuff that's better on their architecture. But
so to that point about abstraction earlier and about extensibility, it seems to me like there are two possible problems. One is that if you're building a layer on top, you're already constrained by the things that they've exposed. So any abstraction beyond that, in some sense, doesn't get richer. It papers over it. And then you've got the possibility of building least common denominator or making two things on two clouds look as much alike as you can because they're not actually as much alike, like trying to gloss away details about how storage works or latency or reachability in the network. I mean, isn't that a problem? You build a layer above it, somebody instantiates and runs an entire system and then realizes that the characteristics they're running under are not actually, say on EC2, are not the ones they're running under elsewhere. And their running system actually fails because they didn't get a lot of decision in that. You made it look like a thing, but it's A and B are not the same.
I think that might be the case, but I think there are going to be lots of so the cloud provider differences, I would submit, are a short-term thing. That 5 to 10 years from now, if we've all done this right, the standard by which we've done this right is when the majority of those details are the things that you care about with your service provider will eventually be or should be things like availability, how close the application is to an end user, right? Does it become local to you? Is the latency between, when I go to get my damn Netflix movie, does it come fast or
over
slow?
here or over there? Yeah.
And the magic of how that happens is somehow abstracted from me and put into their code, and then comes from a local data center that's on those are the things we'll care about. The actual specifics of how the cloud manages to give me X VM with crazy amount of memory and crazy, those semantics.
Yeah, there's some
People will try and market them to you, but if they keep doing that and we're still absorbing those problems in 10 years, 5 years?
Do you think the vendor has no incentive to continue to fracture those APIs?
I think they do. I think every vendor will try and fracture. I think every vendor will try and make it more and more complex. Their APIs will all become more and more complex. And I think there's and not necessarily complex in order to just be complex. It will be complex in order to offer differentiated services, right? And they'll do that because they feel that's the right way to add lots of zeros to the bottom line.
Well, ultimately, that's what drives customer value. I mean, yes, there's tremendous customer value in having a common, basic, predictable, consistent set of infrastructure, but the way that it's being described today is relatively constrained. We have the first incarnation of how people think about infrastructure, but practically, is it going to really look like that in 10 years' time? Are there going to be a bunch of other shaped things that you can do that bring tremendous value. And do you really want to think about this relatively closed, static container as being the essential building block? Because often it doesn't fit everything you're trying to do. So I don't think I certainly know that Google is not incented in fracturing the space for the sake of fracturing the space, but we absolutely have to have the ability to deliver differentiated value to our customers. We have a tremendous amount of infrastructure and services and intellectual property that we've built out over a long time, and we have to have the ability to deliver that to our customers so that they can get that value.
And with that pressure from every player, because every player is going to feel exactly the same way, I find it difficult to believe that it's going to be a simple thing to get those vendors together to standardize APIs themselves, and the standardization is going to happen at an abstraction layer above as a function of evolution of all of the APIs and people finding over time what the commonalities are and what the best ways are to abstract those commonalities into some layer. And this is what, Red Hat, when they launched the Delta Cloud project, sort of had this clear idea, but way before it was useful to have it, I think. And they talked about Delta Cloud as being the libvirt of cloud, right? It would be the thing that would abstract all that away. But I think we're still too early, and I think there's too much difference between what the cloud platforms offer at this point to make that abstraction effective yet, because Amazon has services that go all the way out to there. And I know at Eucalyptus, we're just catching up, bit by bit here.
Well, you'll never catch up, right?
What's that?
You'll never catch
up. We never will catch up. And I think it's okay that we don't catch up. I think we just need to catch up enough to continue to provide value to people who want that interaction, right? But we don't have to catch up all the way. We just have to catch up enough to satisfy our customers.
So to sort of bookend the conversation here, because we've been talking a lot about services in infrastructure, talk about platform for a moment. Quick show of hands if I can see back there far enough. How many of you have major deployments in the cloud right now? Not as many as I would have expected, actually. How many are
seriously Amazon? So that guy's from Amazon, so you don't count. I see you.
I like the judgment. You don't count. How many of you have major deployments in what would be considered a platform? Something like App Engine, Heroku, Azure. All right, so in this sample set, it still looks like infrastructure is winning. So the thing that I wanted to ask about is, from my perspective, it seems like we've jumped the gun. We're a little early on the whole platform thing because the capabilities any platform offers are static right out the door. And if you either haven't chosen well or you don't have a full cohort of services, you're going to get initial customers who do the thing you demoed, and then they're going to run out of runway.
The demo thing
static.
What's that?
Define static just a little bit more.
If you offer a particular kind of networking, or you offer a particular, the simplest one would be a particular size of instance, or you don't have control over instantiation, you go through some API where it auto scales for you, then it's been chosen and you don't get to do.
It seems to me that one of the key sort of characteristics that's different is that with infrastructure as a service, you can at least conceptualize how you might take a legacy workload and move it into that. And with platform as a service, no, that's not. Platform as a service by its nature means you write it from scratch using all the goodness that the platform
So it may be great, but in order to take advantage of it, you build to great. You don't port your old thing along.
That seems to be how it looks to me.
I mean, if you architect your application intelligently, then I think there will be an opportunity to port rather than just start from scratch every time. I'm not sure I understand the notion of static. I do understand the notion of, it does what it demos versus it does what it says on the tin. So the marketing is way ahead of actually what a platform is capable of. At the same time, I don't think it's too early to be looking at platform because in some ways, if we wait till the infrastructure guys figure out what they're doing, it'll be the game over. So I think, we're going to have this kind of leapfrogging going on. I think the Google App Engine is a great example of that. I mean, they didn't wait; they just got on with it and they just put it out there. And I think, and yes, it had certain constraints. It will continue to have constraints. Those are actually the constraints that make it what it is. And so, and it's not static, it's fluid. So it's evolving. It's swimming. Maybe it's a shark. If it stops swimming, it dies. I don't know. I mean,
We're talking about Google, right?
yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously I have opinions about this, and I would say a few things. When we introduced App Engine, it's definitely was a technology that was designed to solve a specific use case. Mm-hmm. And most of our success has been, to your point, in solving that specific use case. We've also had a tremendous amount of success, interestingly, in people that just want a very simple environment, like a very casual environment. Like our internal IT guys have completely adopted it en masse. They love it. It's the technology that runs almost all of our...
Did you notice, you actually got a quick reaction there when you said, like, really? That's interesting.
You might find that surprising, but when I speak to like our CDO and the guys that are actually running long-term applications, they love App Engine. They love it because it's such a simple, easy, productive, accessible environment. So we actually are, interestingly, we have a lot of adoption at the high end, where people want to build these massive internet scalable applications. And we're actually starting to see a tremendous amount of interest from the sort of casual IT productivity application developer, because they don't want to reason about servers and all of the complexity that's associated with that. And so we have this dichotomy of, it's originally positioned as this. It turns out we're getting a lot of adoption here. How do we create, a blend? Like, how do we create a platform that appeals to a much broader cross-section? And I think practically, we have to embrace an open story. We've recognized that. In a large part, that's why Compute Engine is we're bringing Compute Engine to the mix, because ultimately we don't want to compete with the ecosystem, and we certainly don't want to compete with the open source community. There's a tremendous amount of innovation and power that comes out of the ecosystem and the open source community. And so a closed, entirely walled garden system precludes our users from getting all of that amazing sort of innovative lift. And that's why we have to open it up.
So we owe it to ourselves to avoid the middleware wars of old, right? Now, whether we will succeed in that, I don't know, but that was very painful.
I think history shows us the battle may be short, but we'll fight it, because there's very little chance of avoiding it, I think. As we were talking about those capabilities, I was thinking it sounds a little bit like App Engine is something like Visual Basic or Power Builder of this generation. People do something very, very quickly with it. I like the laugh. People do something very, very quickly with it, but it's not necessarily the thing you want to show your friends, because you're kind of embarrassed. And you're like, oh, no, I write in C++.
It still gets the job done. Come on.
Exactly, but it gets the job done every time.
I take exception to that.
I didn't say it was bad.
It's interesting because at the one side, it's the kind of suite that you can run a massively complex internet scale campaign, right? And we do that really well. Like we ran the royal wedding on the platform, massive spikes of growth, seamlessly handled, no outages, no concerns. And then at the same time, it also is just an amazingly productive environment for that class of application. And so, I think that hints. You've got 2 points now, and we can start to draw a line between those points. And it hints at where this is going to go. And we recognize that we have to bring a whole bunch of additional capabilities to the table, a whole collection of services. We have to make it open so that other people can provide services that can be consumed in the space. But I think you can see how this is going to get built out and become a much richer platform that appeals to a very broad range of users.
So I think there's an interesting detail here. So when we talk about App Engine, and you could draw a line so App Engine's kind of one thing, but Heroku being kind of another. Like a lot of these PaaSes that are very early days, that are kind of sort of new, these are still very giant consumers of infrastructure as a service stuff underneath.
Absolutely.
And
Heroku's the perfect example of
exactly,
that.
Right? And
for folks who don't know, Heroku runs on top of EC2, so it's a PaaS on top of
it's also one of the many PaaSes that runs on top of Ubuntu. So
yeah.
It's got to run on something.
Exactly. Well, most of the cloud does. So yeah, it's very interesting. So these guys will drive. So I think having a discussion about APIs and that sort of thing, it's also semi-backwards, because people who are building PaaSes, the key part of a PaaS underneath is that as your application grows, it's going to magically underneath do all of the stuff that's required to sort of scale how it's being used, where it's going, and that sort of thing, without you, the end user, knowing it, right? So when you run an instance on Heroku, when you spin up a Dynamo thing, you don't know the details of where that's going, kind of in the nuances of how those things are being done. It's being handled by something for you. But by all of the work they do with Amazon, and and sort of we know when things go wrong, because as Ubuntu customers, they work with us to sort of do that on both the Amazon side and the Heroku side. They're huge users, and they find every speed bump, and they very quickly address them, and lots of the concerns that they have about the API sort of go back into Amazon, and there's lots of stuff that's going on there. So people who are running, I would imagine things like App Engine, eventually when it runs on top of the Google Compute Infrastructure, they'll learn a lot about how to run a IaaS, what's most important, where things are.
So if we think about it from that perspective, if we think about what is platform as a service today as somewhat, it's sort of like a policy container on top of infrastructure.
That's a great way of putting it.
Yeah, you're building platform as a use case. And we look at the ones we've got today. So App Engine, there are clearly use cases that are super powerful in App Engine. We know what people are doing on Heroku. If you were to start evolving those on top of infrastructure, what capabilities are we missing? What do those not have today?
So one of the things I think that's missing is, I think magic is not always good, and I think magic in some cases I'll defer to or I'll delegate to magic. It is fine, but actually
until the magic fails.
Until it fails or until I want to do something different. So I think
You just don't have powerful enough magic. That's the problem.
Yeah, no, I would agree, and I think it comes down to there's really three things that are delivered by platform as a service. If you think about it, the one is seamless management, the ability to square out code, manage the life cycle of the application, and reason about it as a composite system.
So the deployment and application lifecycle management is a thing that's sort of poorly served right now.
It's a bit more than that, because there's a highly dynamic component to it.
Right.
If you think about application lifecycle management as the static, moving from this to this to this, that's part of it. But there's also a big part of platform as a service is dynamic control.
yes.
Yes.
So you can actually have sort of simple declarative rules that support dynamic control. And that's a very powerful thing. The second piece of this is an efficient execution container. So a scalable, efficient execution container so that you're not paying a bunch of money for a resource of which you're only using a small portion. So you think about it as sort of a managed application server that is dynamically scaled based on what you're actually doing with it. And then the third thing that platform as a service is high-value consumable services. And that has to be, provider-delivered high-value services, but it also needs to include services that are provided by the ecosystem, by the community. Like, to be successful as a PaaS provider, it doesn't make sense to shut out folks that are doing awesome NoSQL innovation. Like, they should be able to bring that to the table.
That's a really good point, and I think that has been a deficiency so far of some of the implementations, is that you can't insert new services in a first-class
It's
fashion.
a huge problem.
Next to the vendors.
Cloud Foundry, I rest my case. So basically, what you're saying is deployment is just the first move in a complex game of chess. So, rolling out a service is not something you do and then you go, I'm done.
Right.
It's something that is going to evolve over time. I think you want the ability to at least step in and control that, or at least give hints, set constraints, whatever language you want to use here, so that you're actually guiding that process. So it's not automagic that automatically blows up. Or
and I
automatically.
think Craig snuck in another really important notion, which is it's about resources. It's not about servers.
The efficient use of the underlying resources is essentially what I believe, a PaaS consumer is expecting. I mean, it's part of the contract that we will do a phenomenally good job of managing those resources. And if that means smarter containers, so it's not based on virtual machines, but it's based on lightweight containers, LXC, whatever, there's an awful lot what we can do to actually make that more efficient. And then the last point was the most important, the extensibility, the ability to add or drop in new services that are not second cousins, twice removed, that somehow half work, in some truly half-assed way, but become part of the core, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when I look back across sort of mainstream IT, you look at the value that people like VMware brought to server virtualization and the ability to drive up occupancy, drive up utilization, and create abstractions of workload from underlying technologies. In many ways, the move towards PaaS and a lot of the technologies that actually provide some of these workload abstractions are offering the same set of capabilities on top of this infrastructure. And it will be all the more powerful if there's deep vertical integration between the provider that gives that management capability and the provider that's actually delivering these containers to execute inside. Because you can, in a dynamic situation, in a dynamic environment, you can get so much more out of the infrastructure if you have that deep tie-in between the two layers.
Do we care about PaaS portability?
So on that,
interop.
there we go. So the way I wanted to think about that and tie that together, one of the things, so I sent some notes around to these guys before we got started, thinking about instead of sort of imperative style APIs where you tell your infrastructure what you want it to do, if you were to think about this from a programming language design perspective, could you do something that is declarative? Could you build a language that is descriptive of the capabilities that you want, and then have the platform, you declare these things, and the platform makes claims about whether or not it can do that for you. Is there a common ground like that? We want to talk about capabilities. We'd like to talk about describing them, which is radically different than what we do today.
So yeah, I mean, it's been extraordinarily difficult to produce a sufficiently descriptive DSL that can actually describe everything. So I think while there's massive value in having that declarative framework, you always have to have the imperative escape. That's just the practicalities of the world. Like, I think, people end up in a situation where the DSL becomes, so fragmented and overbearing if you try to describe all of everything, in a purely declarative construct. So you have to have that imperative escape, and ideally, the imperative component should be represented back up into the declarative component so that you can add these little.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. A DSL is in a way your shop front, but behind it, I think you'll have something else going on. I mean, certainly that. I mean, I have to declare an interest. I mean, Brooklyn is taking that point of view that the best way of doing this is to program the infrastructure and program and treat the components you're working with and the wiring and so on as something that you want to actually describe programmatically, rather than in some kind of. And I mean, how it manifests.
Take a similar approach with Juju and Charms.
Exactly.
Right?
So how
it's
it
about
manifests
building a common
itself.
platform, Ubuntu, and then on top of that, you'll do things as you need them and tell them exactly what to be.
Exactly.
So we look at. I mean, that's I think a thing is we're going to see lots of these. We're going to see lots of common elements, and as these common elements become more and more exposed, right? So. In our case, we have kind of Ubuntu, which is sort of everywhere. People sort of know that it's there, and then they can build stuff on top of it, which is one of the sort of first ways that you can sort of let the extensibility. You can add new things. You can put new stuff on top. That's one of the better ways to do it.
So one of the things that would be good would be to sort of take some of the goodness from Juju, but separate it from the Ubuntu sort of assumptions, so that and that's. I mean, Brooklyn's approach is to say we're Switzerland. I don't know whether that's a good or a bad thing these days. I mean, whatever country you pick on,
neutral ground.
Yeah, attempting to be neutral at least, and saying,
great chocolate.
It does have great chocolate. It has a fantastic army, although it mainly does ceremonial duty. So what else can I say? It's got a navy, but that's pretty pointless.
So according to the clock here, we've run out of time. I assume at some point they'll sweep us off the stage.
It's only Pedernets, so
that's true.
We agree we'll just keep talking through his session.
Yeah, we're going to filibuster Mr. Ulander.
There we go. We'll see if there's a cage match at some point.
Right, we've been told.
Oh, there we go.
He's doing a dance for us. Okay.
Oh, there we go. I just got the signal. Well, thank you very much for joining me. I think everyone will be around for questions if you'd like afterwards, out in the hall, wherever. Thanks again.
That's good. Thanks.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.